My name is Tom Coleman, and I'm the Executive Director of Spectrum Institute. And today we're going to be doing an interview with one of the trailblazers from the 1970s, who was a gay lawyer back then and advocating for LGBT rights. This interview is a part of the Birds of a Feather project, which is honoring and commemorating the activism by law students and lawyers throughout the decade of the 1970s. And we'll also talk to people a little bit about their life before the 70s and their life after the 70s. With that, I am going to ask Stephen Lachs to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about his where he went to undergraduate school and law school, and we'll begin the conversation there.
My name is Steve Lachs, and I went to undergraduate school at UCLA, graduated from there in 1960. Sounds like a long time ago, it was. And then I started law school up at Berkeley, spent my first year there. And then for very complicated reasons, I ended up transferring back to UCLA and completed my last 2 years of law school at UCLA. I graduated in June of 1963, took the August bar, and was sworn in January of 1964. And so I've been part of the bar in California for quite a while.
Let's go back to the beginning of how Stephen Lachs began. So if you could tell us a little bit about your, where you were born, your family life, your early life.
I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. When I was around 13, we moved not to out here yet, but to an area called the Rockaways in New York. And then when I was 16 years old, my family moved to Los Angeles, and I was a senior in high school. I was in the middle of my senior year and uprooted and moved to LA, and I ended up graduating from University High School in Los Angeles. That was basically it. From there, I ended up going to UCLA, et cetera.
When did you first really realize that you were gay?
That depends on your definition. Because first of all, anybody that listens to this, unless they're as old as I am or as old as you are, which is equally, no, they may not understand what life was like then. For example, as far as I know, the word gay was not even popularly used for homosexual men until sometime in the mid-50s. Even then, it was not really used a lot. So you didn't know very much about gay. We didn't have computers where a 10-year-old could go online and see everything. We didn't have television shows that had homosexuals in it. I mean, well, they were in it. They just weren't in a role playing a homosexual. It was an entirely different world. And where you even learned about the concept of gay was quite different than it is today. For me, I know I understood that I was attracted to some guys when I was probably 11, or maybe 11 and a half, going on to 12, sometime around that. Did I know what that meant? Not at all. Had no idea. But that continued. And by the time I was maybe 12 and a half, close to 13, maybe, I sort of knew what was going on in my mind. Again, I really wasn't certain of what it was called and everything, but I knew what I liked. That was clear. And that continued until I pretty much got into college And then I really had a much clearer understanding.
So basically, you had the feelings, you knew kind of what they meant, but there was no label for it at first. So let's say then you get into college. So tell us about your college years, undergraduate years, and law school years as a gay person. Tell us whether you were out or semi-out, or what it felt like being a gay person in college. And the students today have a whole different experience.
First of all, there was no way that I could ever find out what a gay person does. I didn't know there were gay bars. And of course, when I started UCLA, I was just ending 16. I was just turning 17 when I started. I couldn't even get into a bar if I wanted to. I knew nobody in California because we had just really moved there. And so I joined a fraternity. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful experience. And I ended up with a family immediately of 80 fraternity brothers or so. And I was very active in my fraternity. I became president of the fraternity and very, very active. When I was a pledge in my fraternity, the brothers wanted to make sure that we made grades and didn't flunk out. So they required us to get 20 hours of study a week signed in by fraternity brothers. In other words, you'd go to the library, go to the fraternity house, and they'd sign. So very early on, I went to the library. And one evening, I'm studying there, and I had to go to the men's room. And I go down to the men's room in the library. It's no longer the main library, but it was then. I go down, very nice men's room, stalls with these very, very thick marble walls between them. And I'm sitting there, and I hear a strange sound from the stall next to me. And I look over, I hadn't even noticed it. There was this huge hole in this thick marble wall. Somebody had drilled a hole. And I look at the hole, and there's a guy in the next stall masturbating. And then he's looking over at me. Well, I just became so frightened, so scared, that I just about ran out of the place. I was back the next night. I'd say any number of times during college, you could find me studying in the library and having to use the men's room. And so that was pretty much my experience during college. The other part of my life, the major part of my life, was, of course, in class and all of that. But socially, it was in my fraternity. It was dating some wonderful, wonderful sorority girls and stuff like that. And so I had my full-on life with my fraternity, with college, with studying, and at the same time, going to study in the library.
Okay.
So that was college.
Yeah. So how did that change in law school? Did it change at all, or?
Well, of course, I didn't have the UCLA library when I was up at Berkeley. That was tough. But it was interesting because I was dating a really wonderful young woman while I was in law school. At the same time, I can't even remember how I found it, but I ended up in a gay bar. It was the first time I was in a gay bar, and that really changed things. And I started going there, and I met some guys and stuff. But at the end of the year, I transferred, as I said, back to UCLA. And now I was able to work my way. I met a few guys in bars. I met a few guys other places. and began, not very much, but to socialize with some gay men. At the same time, most of my life was concentrated on other things. So I wasn't really full-blown gay man. Here I am, you know.
So that continued through law school. How did things change when you graduated from law school? What did you do?
I belonged to a fraternity, which was a primarily Jewish fraternity. It still is, AE I became active with some of my other fraternity brothers in the Jewish community. And I was very much involved with what was then called the United Jewish Welfare Fund, the big foundation in Los Angeles. In the meantime, I met more gay men and started socializing. And I would go to parties, and there were a lot of gay guys living up in the Hollywood Hills, beautiful homes, great views. And I was socializing and meeting gay men through these social events.
And what era was this? What were years were you involved?
This would be the mid to late 60s. At the time, I had, as I said, I was sworn in 64. I worked for a couple of law firms and then opened my own firm. And that's what I was pretty much doing.
So now in the, let's say the late 60s, were you aware of the concept of gay rights? Were you aware of gay activism yet?
I was aware of it. I knew, for example, the gay rights movement in my mind at that time was pretty much people marching, not necessarily marching, but activists, out there activists, possibly getting arrested, and that type of thing. That is pretty much what I saw. What I saw was basically in the newspaper.
Right.
And in the newspaper, that's what you see. You'll see somebody being arrested. The people I was socializing with were not people who were involved in any kind of gay rights. They just wanted the social life.
Tell us about becoming a deputy public defender.
That's a whole little story. But what happened was there was what I think was called the last of the peaceful demonstrations against the Vietnam War out at what was then, it's now Cal State Northridge. There were 400 or so kids there, and they were protesting. The police told them to disperse. They didn't. Very peaceful, and they were all arrested. The city attorney broke these 400 kids into groups of 4 for purposes of trial. And the public defender's office would only represent 1 in each group because of conflicts of interest. And so there was a call out in the legal community to represent a group, come and represent the 3 other people in this group. And I had never been in a court, really. And so I thought, oh, wow, this is great. And I ended up representing these 3 guys. The public defender represented the 4th. It was going to take 3 days to try this case. It ended up being 14 weeks because my public defender, co-counsel, and I discovered a lot of what was going on, et cetera. We reopened discovery and on and on. And he and I and the city attorney and the judge, we all became very good friends. But he particularly, he was an amazing, amazing lawyer. Halfway through the trial, he said, Steve, you really should consider becoming a deputy public defender. And I thought, wow, that's a great idea. I had to wait until the trial was over. And once the trial was over, I applied and became a deputy public defender and closed up my office. And it was the best thing. It was just an amazing, amazing experience I had in that office. I was so happy I did that.
Oh, your term as a public defender or deputy public defender spanned from what year to what year?
I joined the office in, I believe it was like June or so, 1969. And I was in the public defender's office until around June of 1975. And in 1975, I was sitting in court waiting for the judge to call my case. I don't know what happened, but I thought to myself, the judge came out, he was doing whatever he was doing. And I thought to myself, you know, I could do that. Soon afterwards, there was something in the legal paper about applications to become a Superior Court commissioner. And I applied to become a Superior Court commissioner. There were, God knows, 150 applicants. They were going to choose 3 people. We went through the whole process, oral exams, written exams, and I ended up being one of the 3 people chosen. So I ended up in, I think it was around June, July of 75, I left the public defender's office and became a Superior Court commissioner.
Let's dial it back a few years to 1972, which was a consequential year for you as well as for me. Tell us about 1972, about meeting the gay law students, about being introduced to the Gay Community Services Center, how that year kind of changed your life.
Well, as you know, the center, the Gay Community Services Center is what it was called then, and it was fairly new. I went to a party and there were a whole bunch of guys there, obviously, and I met a guy named Terry O'Brien. And Terry, it turned out, was a law student. I think he was at Loyola, but I'm not sure. We talked a good part of that evening, really nice guy. And he was just, he was a law student and he had never met a gay lawyer. There were very few openly gay lawyers. In talking, he said, you know, I'm part of a group of gay law students that are meeting at the center. And I would really like it if you would come by because I think they would like to meet you. So I said, oh, sure. And he told me when the next meeting was. And I've told this any number of times, but I drove over to the meeting. The center at that time was in this old Victorian building on Wilshire Boulevard with this steep staircase going up to the entrance. Today, they couldn't do it because there's no access. But in any event, I parked my car on the street and I looked up at that staircase and I sat there. I think I sat there for well over 5 minutes. And I just sat there thinking, do you really want to go there? Because if I knew that if I walked up those steps and went in that door, there was going to be a big change in my life. And finally, after whatever it was, 5 minutes, 5 hours, whatever it was, I ended up going up the stairs, going in, and I met this remarkable group of guys, one of them being Tom Coleman. Great group of guys. Tom, Rand Schrader, Barry Coppola, of course, Terry O'Brien. And one person I always tell people about because it says so much about what it was to be gay then. There was a guy, and I don't know if you remember him, but he drove up from San Diego. He was in law school in San Diego. He drove up to LA. He came to the meetings. He gave everybody his first name, but he wouldn't tell anybody what his last name was because he was so afraid that he would be, for the future, tagged as gay. Even though, who was he with? Everybody else were gay law students. But that's what life was like then. So I had a great evening, left the meeting. On my way out, there were 2 men that introduced themselves. One was Morris Kite, who was a major activist in the gay community and also a founder of the center. And the other was Don Kilhefner, who was at that time the executive director of the center. I started chit-chatting with them. At some point, they said, Morris said, by the way, Steve, do you know that we do legal counseling here in the center every Monday night? And I said, no, I didn't know that. And I said, out of curiosity, who's the lawyer that's doing the counseling? And he said, oh, we have our insurance agent doing the counseling. This is not a good thing, because if something doesn't work out with whoever is getting the counseling, they could end up suing the center, and it'll turn out you were having an insurance agent doing legal advice. You can't do that. You have to have a lawyer. And Morris looked at Don, who looked back at Morris, and Morris said, Steve, would you consider doing the legal counseling? And I said, how did I get into this? I said yes. And so the next Monday night, if you'll remember, the center barely had money for furniture. And so I was in a room with bean bags. People would come in. I was thrown out of my apartment. I was fired from my job, and I was doing legal counseling at the center. So suddenly I'm in the middle of it. And it changed my life.
So then how did that expand? Tell us about the various ways in which you were involved in gay rights in the 1970s. That seems to be the jumping off point.
I met a man. I always considered Don Kilhefner and Morris Kite as two of my three mentors. And I met the third, and his name was Sheldon Andelson. He was one of, as far as I knew, the only two openly gay lawyers in Los Angeles. And I met Sheldon, and we became very, very good friends. And Sheldon was the chair of the board of directors of the center. And he invited me to be on the center board. And so I think it was around 1974 that I ended up on the board of directors of the center. The whole board was only 7 people. And in part because of Sheldon, who liked to really control things, we did everything. There's going to be a booth at some event, and we're going to be serving yogurt. Oh, the board would talk about what flavors of yogurt. And the center was growing, expanding. It was as exciting as you could possibly imagine. And so I became very much involved with the expanding gay and lesbian community through that. At the same time, I became involved with a group of young guys who would have been called yuppies. I don't know whether they use that expression anymore, but we were yuppies. Some lawyers, a psychologist, there was a guy who worked for the mayor, that type of thing. And we wanted to do stuff as gay men in this community. And the group was called Orion. In 1977, there was going to be a city election. One of the people who was up for re-election was a guy in the valley who was pretty homophobic. And so one of our people in Orion, he and another guy decided they're going to try and do something in this election to get this guy out of office. And they started a group in 1976 called Influence 77. And they had a big meeting, grassroots people, to do something about this. And I went to that meeting. They ended up appointing committees. There was a fundraising committee. And Bill, the guy from Orion, a friend of mine, said, Steve, would you go to this fundraising committee meeting to see what they're doing and how they're doing? So I went to the fundraising meeting, and they were delightful, delightful guys. But they were talking about things like, let's have a bake sale. Now, my experience with the United Jewish Welfare Fund was big time fundraising. And I knew something about fundraising. You don't spend 500 hours baking cupcakes and making $15. That's not fundraising. So after the meeting, I called up Bill. And remember, we didn't have our cell phones and stuff. And I called Bill and I told him what I had observed. And I said, Bill, this isn't the way you do fundraising. I'm sorry. I spoke to Peter Scott, who was sort of the head of Orion. And I said, Peter, this is not going to work. So Peter and Bill and I got together and we said, let's do some real fundraising for this election that's coming up in the spring of 1977. Well, we knew a lot of guys with money. All these guys who had the houses in the Hollywood Hills with big parties, they had a lot of money. So what we did, there was a bar restaurant called the Carriage Trade on Beverly Boulevard, and they had a private dining room. We reserved that. We invited 20 guys who we knew could afford it to come to dinner with us. And there were maybe 4 or 5 of us that were putting this together. Knowing something about fundraising, if you ask people to pledge money, and the first person says, I pledge $50, that sort of sets the bar for everyone else. So we went to one of the 20 guys who we knew, and we said, do something for us. Pledge a high amount as soon as we start asking. Everybody came, 20 guests, 4 or 5 of us. I gave the big emotional speech, followed up by Rob Eichberg, a psychologist, who did the ask. And as soon as he asked, our friend pops up and says, I pledge $1,000. Well, $1,000 was just unheard of. And it was crazy. We went around the room. We had 20 people each pledge $1,000. And so we raised $20,000, which today I think is like 100,000. It was just an unheard of amount. We didn't even know what to do with it. And we thanked everybody, et cetera, et cetera. The next day, Peter Scott comes over to my house and we're sitting there and say, what do? We don't have a bank account. So where are we going to deposit the money? To open a bank account, you need a name. We don't have a name. We don't have anything. And so we sat around and we figured we have to come up with a name. We couldn't have gay in it because none of these guys was going to write a check with gay in it so that their bookkeeper or accountant could see that. So we came up with the name of what it was, the Municipal Election Committee of Los Angeles. This was for this municipal election, which became called MECLA. And so that's where it started. We came up with the name, we opened a bank account, people sent in their checks to MECLA, boom. And from that was, I think, maybe the first gay PAC in the United States.
So now after MECLA, you said that was 77. The next 2 years, a lot of things must have happened, and then all of a sudden your life changed again in 1979. So tell us about what happened to you in 1979, the big change, and how that came about.
Our community, the gay and lesbian community, was tiny. There were a few organizations. That's it. Today, it's all over the place. But the people that I was involved with were became very close with Governor Brown, who was the governor then. There were a lot of people who were ticked off because when he ran for re-election in 1978, he had not appointed any openly gay people to anything. And I remember being at meetings where people were saying, well, we don't want to support him for his re-election for governor. He's done nothing for us. They told the governor, you have to do something. The decision that he made was to appoint an openly gay judge. And I had, by now, in 1979, I had been a Superior Court commissioner doing judicial work for 4.5 years. So I was all, I had the experience, whatever reputation I had. And so I ended up being appointed as a judge in September of 1979.
Was that a splash on the newspapers?
Yes, it was a big splash. I have somewhere here, I have the headline. First of all, it was in newspapers all around the world. The headline in the LA Times was "Avowed homosexual appointed a judge." And I was the avowed homosexual. But I started getting mail from all over. People would write to Judge Stephen Lachs, Los Angeles Superior Court, Los Angeles, California, and I would get it. And I got mail from guys all over with newspaper articles. I still have an article from a Greek newspaper about all of this. It was really a big thing. And I got so much mail from gay guys from all over. Thank you so much. I've been so concerned about my life, and now I know I can do something with it. And then at the same time, I was getting hate mail. And so it was sort of interesting, but it made the press big time. I ended up going to a lot of different schools and law groups throughout the country. I was invited to speak. It was quite a thing for its time.
Tell us about your experiences within the judicial branch, among your judicial colleagues. So you were appointed in 1979. How did that go? And how did it evolve?
For me, it was really no problem. And one of the little things I can give you as an example, okay, I'm now appointed. I now have to, the presiding judge needs to give me an assignment. What court am I going to be in? I was thinking, well, I had been in the public defender's office before becoming a commissioner. He's probably going to put me in a criminal court. He called me up and he said, Steve, and this was September of 1979. He said, under our law in California, you have to run for election in the spring of 1980. With all of this publicity, I'm going to be running for election. And there were a lot of people that didn't like the idea of gay at that time. So he said, if I put you in a criminal court, you may end up with some big case that's going to get a lot of publicity. And depending on what you do, it may not be the best thing for you with this election coming up. So we talked about it, and he said, I have an idea. He offered to put me in a court where it was the mental health court. And nobody really knew about it. But he said, you can get out of there by 1:30, 2 o'clock every day. And you can go and do all of the campaigning and fundraising that you need for this election. And so I said, that sounds really good. And he assigned me to this court. And that's where I went. And I was able to get out. I was able to raise money, da 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 da. Of course, it turned out nobody ever challenged me. We returned all the money.
Okay.
But that was an example of a judge who was really concerned about me. Most of the judges were as wonderful as could be. A friend of mine told me that when I wasn't there, that he would go into the judges' lounge in the courthouse that we had. And he said there were a few guys that were saying unkind things about me, but never to my face. As far as I was concerned, the vast, vast majority of the judges were just wonderful. Remember, I knew a lot of them from my career.
Tell us about how and when the Gay and Lesbian Judges Association was formed and any role you had in that.
As you know, there are a ton of legal groups meeting at different times. And in those days, I don't know whether you can still do it, but in those days, you were able to have a meeting for your Los Angeles group in Paris. And you could then write off your 7 days in Paris as a business expense. And this was just wonderful, I thought. Mary Morgan, by this time, had been appointed as the very first open lesbian. She was appointed to the municipal court in San Francisco. And Mary and I became good friends. And there was some meeting going on that we were at, and we sat down, the two of us, and I suggested to Mary, I said, why don't we start a group of gay and lesbian judges so that we can figure out where we want to meet and have a great time meeting and write it off. And we can just have our own group. And she thought this was a great idea. And so we started the first gay lesbian judges group.
So this was an international group?
We called it international. We had no idea whether there would ever be any judges from any place other than the United States. We knew there were other lesbian and gay judges by then. We didn't know whether they would join or not, but it seemed like a good thing. And in fact, it was. I mean, we ended up, and we talked about the fact that there was an awful lot we could do beyond going to a meeting to try and further the idea of having lesbian and gay judges, that it should be an acceptable thing in our society. It shouldn't be a strange phenomenon. We wanted to make it accepted in our society.
Tell us about the proposal to change the ethical rules for judges about being members in organizations that exhibit a bias against certain groups of people, like the Boy Scouts, gay scouts, and scout leaders, and so on.
California judges group had rules about that. You should not belong to a group which discriminates against whatever, Jews, African Americans, whatever. And so at one of the meetings of the statewide group, my friend and colleague Keith Wissett and I, he was gay, we got up and said, we fully agree with this whole concept. And by the way, Boy Scouts of America, and I had been a Boy Scout, Boy Scouts of America discriminates against gays. And we are asking this group to tell judges that they cannot belong to the Boy Scouts of America as whatever, scoutmaster, whatever. That faced a lot of resistance. It never got anywhere. A judge I am still in contact with today, came up to me. He said, Steve, I totally understand what you're talking about, but I'm involved with the Boy Scouts. My kids are in the Boy Scouts, and I can't give the Boy Scouts up. It's too important. So they just turned it down.
Now, turning to a more personal aspects, tell us about your, where you live now, your relationship, its longevity. Did you have other long-term relationships in your life? What is your family and spousal life like, and what was it like?
In 1980, I was asked to speak at Cal State Northridge, and I met a guy. He had started college in New York. He's from New York. He dropped out after a couple of years, went to work, moved out to California, and decided he was going to finish up and get his degree. So he was now out at Cal State Northridge, and he was part of the group that put this speaking event together. And so I went out there, I met him, I was smitten. A couple of days later, we had exchanged phone numbers, and a couple of days later, I called him, and this last April, we celebrated our 42nd anniversary together. Yeah, it's been quite a while. I mean, the 70s was an amazing time for a lot of gay men, and there was no holds barred. There was nothing to even stop you from doing whatever crazy things you wanted to do. AIDS hadn't even been discovered in the 70s. So it was pretty wild, even for me. But then 1980, I met Michael, and we got together. We started living together 6 months after we met, and we've been together ever since. And if you saw anything in the background moving back and forth, that's our little dog. So we're still here. We live in Rancho Mirage, California, which is outside of Palm Springs. And we have a place back in New York. We're both from New York. And so years ago, we got a place in New York because his family is still there, and we really enjoy going back there a lot.
Finally, is there any message, words of wisdom, encouragement, or anything that you would like to give to the current generation or future generations, but especially the current generation of LGBT law students and lawyers? Based on all your experience and knowing what's going on in the world today, is there anything you would like to share with them?
The thing that I guess is important for me, and let me just tell a little story. We've watched more television in the last 2.5 years than we watched in the 40 years before that. I mean, the pandemic, we didn't even know what streaming was. But the other night, a couple of nights ago, we were watching a show about castles in England, and the castle in York ended up in the late 1100s. There was a small group of Jews who lived in York, and they were terrorized by the people in New York, in York, not New York, in York, England. They ended up in the castle, and to make it short, all 150 people died. And I thought, when I heard that, I had never heard about that. And I didn't know that Jews were thrown out of England. And I thought to myself, it's never changed. It has never, ever changed for Jews. I'm Jewish, and it's never changed. If it was York in the 1100s, it was Egypt with the Red Sea and all of that. It's Nazi Germany. It's constant. I think it's the same thing for our community. I think there will always be people that see us as a minority worthy of being picked on. And so what you have to do is you cannot sit back and relax and say it's over. It's not over. With the Jewish part of me, it's been going on for 5,000 years, and it keeps popping up again. It's the same thing, I believe, with the lesbian, gay community. If you're part of this community and you want to do something for this community, what you have to do is keep paying attention, keep doing things, keep going. Don't sit back and say, oh, look, we can walk on Santa Monica Boulevard and hold hands, so it's over. It ain't over.
Very good advice. Okay, we're going to wrap it up now. Is there anything else that we should cover that you think that we've missed, or have we covered the?
Do you have another 17 hours or so? No, I think this has covered it very well.
Well, Stephen Lachs, thank you very much for all that you've done, the activism that you've done, the friendships that you've forged, the inspiration that you've given to others, just by being yourself and doing your job and doing what you're supposed to do. I'm glad that we're able to hear from your own words about your life.
There is one other thing, if I can just throw this in.
Yeah.
And it's my memory of how fleeting fame is. I'd say it was around a dozen years after I was appointed, all of the newspaper headlines and everything like that. I'm at a gay lawyer's function, and a young guy, 26, 27, comes up to me, introduces himself, and he says, you may not remember me, but I was in your court around a year and a half ago. He was an associate with a major downtown LA law firm. And he said, I didn't say anything, so you may not have noticed me, because I was there with a partner from the firm, and he did all the talking. And we chatted, and he said, I have to tell you, when you came out of your chambers to take the bench, I looked at you and I thought, that is the best dressed judge I have ever seen. I had no idea until tonight that you were gay. And now I know why you were so well dressed. And I thanked him, et cetera, et cetera. A dozen years ago, I was appointed, and today you don't even know I was gay? No less all of the first, Right. You didn't even know I was gay.
Well, I think that's a good point to end on. I'd like to just comment on that before we close. And that is, this is one of the reasons for the Birds of a Feather project. And we've identified 125 law students and lawyers from the 1970s who were active in gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender rights activism. Most, let's say, many of whom I knew because I was also active and paying attention, but a lot of them I didn't know about. And as my colleague, Jay Cohorn, has written in the preface to the memory book that we're going to publish, it's very important about us writing our history and remembering people, for the futures. Each one of them has at least a 2-page biography about what they did and so on. So hopefully this current generation can kind of learn about those who've come before. And so many of the rights that we have today were forged initially by those 125 people in one way or another. Enjoy the rights. Please don't take them for granted. As you say, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, but also remember those who came before, especially those who are deceased, and honor them as the people who are doing the work today, hopefully will be remembered in the future too. So anyway, Steve Lachs, thank you so much.